Welcome to Morphic Labs, and today we are going to be discussing kairosis by itself because I already did a video on this, but that model was using a backward CMF instead of a forward CMF, and I didn't really go deep on the details. I left out a lot of necessary details like what lambda is, how it's calculated, etc. And also, I didn't really touch on the actual paper itself, right? The original kairosis paper. But today, that's what we're going to be talking about. But before we get into that, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button if you want to keep up with more content like this. And if you want to increase your market intelligence, I have a market microstructure and trading systems course plus an advanced market aggregation course for free. The link's in the description. You just got to sign up to be a free member and you'll have it all to yourself. Now, let's get into what kairosis is. But before we do that, this is just a sneak glimpse of my advanced market intelligence aggregation tool. And this version uses a forward CMF instead of a backward CMF. So the math might be different if you ever watched the previous video that I deleted, of course. But let's get into it. Module 10, Bayesian Aggregation Frameworks. This module introduces rigorous Bayesian frameworks for combining multiple information sources, forecasts, and market signals, building on the information theoretic foundations from Aggregation 1. We develop mathematically principled approaches that quantify uncertainty, enable dynamic adaptation, and provide coherent probabilistic aggregation under the axiomatic foundations of Bayesian reasoning, one of my most favorite mathematical abstractions. Now, 10.1, kairosis, Bayesian change point aggregation. Developed by Hassoun, McKay, and Powell in 2025, kairosis represents a significant advancement in dynamic probability forecast aggregation. The method addresses a fundamental limitation of static aggregation, the assumption that the distribution of forecasts remains stable over time. Kairosis uses Bayesian change point detection to construct time-varying weights that adapt to structural shifts in the information landscape. Core principle. The method interpolates between exponential discounting and hard change point detection, constructing a cumulative mass function over possible change points in forecaster time. This CMF provides aggregation weights that naturally downweight older forecasts when structural breaks are detected. The kairosis methodology operates in forecaster time rather than chronological time. If R forecasts are made at a chronological time T sub R for R equals 1 up until R, the forecast order 1 up until R creates a forecaster clock that dilates periods of intense forecasting activity. The method then searches for the change points in this forecaster time. Here's the mathematical formulation. For each possible change point tau, the method constructs a likelihood that the forecasts split into two sets with distinct distributions, where L of t of tau, equals P sub t of x sub 1 up until R times P sub 2 of x sub tau plus 1 up until R, equals the product of P sub 1 of x sub R from R equals 1 up until tau times the product of P sub 2 of x sub R from R equals tau plus 1 up until R, right? Where P sub 1 and P sub 2 are the pre and post change point distributions respectively. Following Holmes of 2025, kairosis specifies these as Dirichlet categorical distributions on binned forecast counts. For a partition of the forecast space into k bins with count vectors into the 1 and into the 2, here's our expression. The probability of forecast assuming T sub Cp is equal to T sub R equals the gamma function. The gamma function is a this special analytical function. I'm assuming you already know what that is if you've taken any high level course on calculus, but whatever. The gamma function of the sum of alpha sub k, where k indexes from 1 up until k, over the gamma function of the sum of n sub k plus alpha sub k, where k indexes from 1 up until k, times the product of the gamma of n sub k plus alpha sub k over gamma of alpha sub k, where k indexes from 1 up until k. This is a non-parametric specification. It makes no assumptions about the shape of the underlying distribution, only about how counts distribute across bins. The distinction matters. The normal MLE approach, Adam and McKay 2007, assumes data is Gaussian per segment and can fail under heavy tails or multimodal forecasts, whereas the Dirichlet categorical only requires sufficient observations per bin. The posterior over change point is the probability of tau, assuming x, our vector of entries, is proportional to the probability of tau times L of tau. The prior P of tau in kairosis follows a geometric distribution, not exponential discounting. The probability of some change point at t sub r equals the assumed probability constant times 1 minus that probability constant raised to the rth order minus the r. The motivation is explicit. For t sub r to be the last change point, there must have been r minus r subsequent interforecast periods without a change point. This prior assigns higher probability to recent change points, r close to r. This differs fundamentally from exponential prior of the exponential of negative lambda times tau, which assigns higher probability to early change points, or small tau. These are directionally opposite priors, encoding different beliefs about where regime shifts occur. Note also that in kairosis, lambda is repurposed with a completely different role. It controls the Dirichlet pseudo-count scaling, alpha sub k equals lambda times t sub cp, not an exponential decay rate. The cumulative mass function, a forward cumulative mass function, unlike in the previous video, was backwards, but whatever. The cumulative mass function provides the weight. W sub r equals CMF of r equals the sum of the probability of tau, assuming x, where tau indexes from 1 up until r. Key insight: the practical effect is a weighting with multiple downward steps as one moves into the past, each corresponding to significant changes in forecast distributions. If no change point is detected, the weighting remains close to exponential discounting. If a single obvious change point exists, it acts as a horizon behind which older forecasts contribute nothing. With a clear shift at r equals 60, R and uppercase R equals 100, CMF weights assign approximately 0 to pre-shift historical data and approximately 1 to post-shift current data, trusting the current regime. Relationship to Bayesian online change point detection, or BOCD. Kairosis and BOCD, Adam and McKay 2007 in section 15.3, are members of the same methodological family. Both use Bayesian change point detection, but differ in their likelihood specifications, prior formulations, and computational modes. Feature column, kairosis column, BOCD column. Likelihood: Dirichlet categorical, non-parametric, BOCD normal conjugate, parametric prior, geometric on the change point at t favors recent change points, geometric on run length. Computation: batch over full window, online recursive update, weight direction. CMF trusts post change point data, run length posterior current segment. The kairosis paper itself, section 4, notes, we believe it will be particularly useful to combine our work with more sophisticated change point detection methods, specifically online methods such as those proposed in Adams and McKay. 2007. A practitioner implementing from this resource should understand this lineage to make an informed choice between them. Let me read it again. The kairosis paper itself, at section 4, notes, we believe it would be particularly useful to combine our work with more sophisticated change point detection methods, specifically online methods such as those proposed in Adam McKay 2007. Now, here's the data. Kairosis performance on 650 meticulous forecasting questions. Aggregation method, Brier score, log score, relevant improvement. Simple mean has a Brier score of 0.1. The smaller the Brier score, the better. Just know that. And also, the smaller the log score, the better. Now, 0.182 is, and if you don't know a Brier score, just to let you know, is the difference between your model's forecast and the actual outcome from that distribution, right? Essentially, you're just taking what the model says the future should be and what the future actually was, difference it, and you have a bias score. Simple mean 0.182, exponential discounting 0.175, hard change point 0.178, and kairosis 2025 has a bias score of 0.168, which is ridiculous, right? A log score of negative 0.634, that's the simple mean, and exponential discounting has a log score of negative 0.612. Hard change point has a log score of negative 0.621, and kairosis has a log score of negative 0.589. And a relative improvement on the simple mean, nothing really, because it's the baseline, so we compare everything to. And exponential discounting is a 3.8% relative improvement from the baseline. Hard change point is 2.2% relative improvement, and kairosis has a 7.7% relative improvement. Now, what are the advantages of this type of aggregation? Adapts to structural breaks without manual intervention, natural interpolation between discounting and hard horizons, grounded in Bayesian change point detection theory, outperforms static methods on empirical forecasting tournaments, provides interpretable weighting functions. Disadvantages: requires sufficient forecast density for reliable change point detection. Choice of prior distribution affects results. Computationally intensive for large forecast histories. Assumes change point in forecaster time, not chronological time. Limited validation in financial market contexts to date. Now, before we get into the code, let's go look at the original paper. And I just want to make things a little bit clear so you understand where the variables in the code are. Not where they are, but what they are. Okay. This is obviously our forward-looking cumulative mass function, but I'm using a discrete one instead of an integral. And as you can see, here's our, okay, okay. It says here that this motivates a geometric prior distribution on the time of the last change point, right? Probability of T sub P, Cp equals T sub R equals P times 1 minus P to the R minus R, which follows from the idea that for T sub R to have been the last change point, there must have been R minus R subsequent inter-forecast periods without a change point. We then update our prior distribution given knowledge of observed forecasts using Bayes' theorem. The probability of T sub Cp equaling T sub R, assuming forecast, equals the probability of forecast assuming T sub Cp equals T sub R times the prior of the P of T sub Cp equals T sub R over P of forecast, right? So this is a very important because it measures our change point. And here, wait. Okay, here is the Dirichlet categorical distribution, right? These other terms, they're all very important, but I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to put the paper's link in the description if you're interested in reading it yourself. And this is essentially what we get at the end of all that yapping, which is the probability of T sub Cp at T sub R, assuming forecast is proportional to the probability of forecast, assuming T sub Cp at T sub R times the probability of T sub Cp at T sub R equals, you already know, we went into that on the other resource, the one I created. And we have very important parameters. We have the binning of 0 up until 1, from which the counts n sub k are derived. And if you don't know n sub k, that's one of the parameters in this distribution. The change point occurrence rate p, so you have to choose your change point occurrence rate p. And these parameters alpha sub k, p sub k, they parameterize the prior distribution for the bin probabilities before and after a putative change point. Now, looking at the necessary parameters that we have to understand, if you want to go read this paper, please, I suggest you do. These are very powerful ideas. We see that lambda sub k equals, not lambda sub k, but alpha sub k equals lambda times t sub cp, where lambda is greater than 0 is a positive scaling factor. Now that we've gotten all the necessary variables out the way, let's get into the code. Now I'm going to be using my 1 minute GBP USD data, but the cool thing about kairosis is that it's not limited to financial data, right? You can use it to forecast anything. As the original paper shows, there was a tournament where the question was, will Donald Trump be president of the US in 2019? And as you can see, a kairosis with a probability mass function essentially didn't do that well over time. But kairosis with a cumulative forward-looking mass function did pretty well, right? It did pretty well. But let's get into the code. I'm getting a little bit distracted. The first 100 entries of our GBP USD data. Let me change the theme just to okay. Now let's pay attention to this legend over here. We have the blue dot, which represents the data, and essentially the size of that blue dot is proportional to the weight. Change the theme again because this theme isn't really rendering the LaTeX. Okay. Now, the data is the blue points, right? And the size of those blue points is proportional to their weight. Kairosis median is at 1.2. Kairosis mean is at 1.2 approximately. Map is called a maximum a posterior of tau equals 2, right? Which is essentially the max posterior with a probability of 0.371. Change posterior tau at 3 is a probability of 0.217. Change posterior at tau equals 4 has a probability of 0.329. Now, this is just 100 entries, but when you're looking at this, you can see that essentially the strategy we choose to bin our data is uniform, right? And we have k equals 5. And essentially, k is the number of bins, right? And I left it at default. Everything is default 5, 0.1, 0.2. It's the original paper's default variables. So I'm gonna just leave it like that. You can change it, play around with it. I'll give away the code on the free member Discord. But as you can see, essentially we had a change point max posterior tau equals 2, right? And that specific change point represents a change in regimes, right? Or at least the distribution of the data. And there's other change point posteriors, but that's only 100 entries, right? You look at the kairosis weights, the weights went from very low to none, and they essentially started adjusting themselves as the forecaster time increased, right? Now, let's try 4,000 entries. As you can see, there's far more interesting change point posterior dynamics. Now, when you look, strategy is uniform: k equals 5, p equals 0.1, lambda equals 0.2, and alpha cap equals 1.0. Now, pay attention to where our map is, or our maximum A posterior, right? Because the maximum A posterior, when it occurred a couple forecasts later, the distribution essentially crossed the median, right? And it came back, crossed, so there was this dynamic shift, and you can see this in the size of the data, right? The weights were increasing accordingly. Now, when you look at the kairosis weights, the weights were very small. Like, it's not zero, but they were very small, very small. And over time, they increased, right? Because of this change point posteriors, more specifically the map, the red one. And as you can see, around 2169, the change point posterior came up, it changed the entire distribution, and look here, the weights increased their values and they stayed fairly similar, right? Let's look at some performance of this type of aggregation. Now, airships by 2019, this is one of the meticulous questions. You can check it out on the paper itself. I recommend you go read it. Very powerful information. Now, we're comparing the kairosis, at least not me, but the authors compared the kairosis model to exponential decay, unweighted median, and 20% median. Now, the question was airships by 2019. It was resolved by no. Kairosis had aimed at a 64% probability of it happening. Exponential decay aimed at a 69% probability of it happening. Unweighted median aimed for a 70% probability of it happening. And 20% median aimed for a 57% probability of it happening, right? So essentially, the 20% median performed better, and the kairosis performed second best. Not bad at all. Let's look at other questions. A medical pathway to complete painlessness. Resolved? No. Kairosis had 52% probability of it happening. Exponential decay had a 63% probability of it happening. Unweighted median had a 0.54% probability of it happening. Not 0.54%, 54%, I mean. 20% median aimed at 60% probability of happening. Now, kairosis obviously wins this one. Let's look at the next one. Will radical new low energy nuclear reaction technologies prove effective before 2019? Resolved as no. As you can see, kairosis had a probability of 19% that would happen. Exponential decay had a probability of 31% that would happen. Unweighted median had a 19%. Oh, yes, it's 19%. 19% probability of that happening. And the 20% median had a 28% probability of that happening. Now, let's look at another question. Will Donald Trump be president of the US in 2019? Was resolved as yes. kairosis had a 0.124 hit, essentially a 12.4% probability, and exponential decay had a 12% probability. Unweighted median had a 13.1% probability, and 20% median had a 14% probability. Clearly, none of them really won this one, and the original kairosis paper talks about this at the end, and I am promoting it again. Please go look at this paper. Very powerful information. But the authors essentially talk about the remarks on kairosis and crowd inaccuracy. So the thing about these kairosis models, as the authors are touching on here, is that they follow the crowd, right? So the probability might be off, but it might be off because the model is essentially following the crowd, right? But let's look back at the results. Will SpaceX launch for Mars in 2018? Window. Resolve. No. Kairosis had a 67% probability that would happen. Exponential decay had a 87% probability that would happen. Unweighted mean had a 50% probability that would happen. And 20% median had about a 86, actually 87% probability that would happen. Will 2017 be the warmest year on record? Resolved. No. Kairosis had a 54% probability that would happen. Exponential decay had a 42% probability that would happen. Unweighted mean had a 60% probability, and 20% median had a 40% probability that would happen. The winner obviously is 20% median. By 2020, will an implemented human embryo with artificially edited DNA be brought to term? Resolved as yes. Kairosis had a 44% probability on this one. Exponential decay had a 31% probability. Unweighted median had a 54% probability. And 20% median had a 45% probability. So the winner here is unweighted mean. Second place goes to 20% median. And third place, kairosis. Will a self-driving car be available for ride services by the end of 2018? Resolved as no. Kairosis had a 43% probability on this one. Exponential decay had a 71% probability on this one. Unweighted median had a 40% probability on this one. And 20% median had a 73% probability on this one. Now, obviously, the winner is unweighted median. Second place goes to kairosis, but this is only just a handful of the benchmarks that happened. I suggest you go look at the original paper. But that's about it for today. If you're interested in increasing your market intelligence, I have a free market microstructure and trading systems course, plus an advanced market aggregation course. The link's in the description. Just sign up to be a free member and you'll have it all to yourself. And if you're interested in something far more advanced, I have my advanced market intelligence aggregation too. If you're interested in this one, just sign up to be a free member and we'll talk on Discord. But that's about it for today.